Hi everybody, welcome to week 7. How are we all? Good, thumbs up, good. Okay, that's good. Okay, so just to kick off, I think we'll start off with a little bit of housekeeping. So for those of you who haven't checked Grade Center recently, anyone watching the recording, the project plans marks are now in the Grade Center. Some of you have asked why you can't access it via Turnitin. I didn't mark it in that way. I downloaded it all and then reloaded it back up to the system with my comments and track changes in a document which is a duplicate of your original document that you submitted. There's also a criteria grid as well that is separate with comments in there as well. So 2 places for you to look for feedback: in the duplicate version of your document and also the criteria rubric as well. You can download them both from Grade Center, so please make sure that you do that. The other thing is that it's come to my attention that for some reason there are 2 email addresses for me listed in the email directory, so CQU's main directory database, and that means that I haven't been receiving some emails because I only have access to one of those. So in a minute I'll put my email address in the chat for you guys to see, but it's n.corbett-jarvis@cqu.edu.au. so please make sure that you use that one in particular to contact me. I have put an announcement about it with the correct email address in there on the Moodle site. Okay, any questions about the feedback or project plan? No? Okay, well, what I would like to do is actually go through some general feedback. I'll just put my email address in, like I said I would, on the chat, and then I'd like to go through some generic feedback for everybody for the project plans. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so there's my official email that I have access to. Okay, so I've got a PowerPoint for it, so Death by PowerPoint, to share with you. So let's just get that up. Okay, so I'm going to start off first with feedback. Really sort of an overview of the feedback. So what I was noticing when I was marking them was that there was some general trends. Now, I've commented on as much as I could within the sort of 30 minutes that I gave myself to mark each one. I mean, I could have kept going, but then you would have never got them back. So I had to draw a line somewhere. So there are some crucial things that I have commented on in your draft, but there's also generic comments that may still apply to you that I haven't actually gone into any detail in your plan. So things like proofreading or AGLC or whatever it happens to be. So I'm just going to go over some of those generic comments now. And I'd like you to then go and reflect on your project plan, what you've actually written, and see whether any of these comments also apply to you in addition to what I've said. So the first thing is, sorry, can everyone see that? Is that all good? Okay, great. So as I said, one of the first things that worries me, and if it's a major concern of mine, I will have flagged it to you, but one of the things that concerns me is scope. 2,500 words sounds a lot when you've got a blank page and you're first starting off, but once you've got quite a lot of information and your research has gathered some momentum, you'll probably find that you have too much information for 2,500 words. So it may become apparent to you, maybe around now or over the next week or two, that you have way too much information to comprehensively cover things. And what that puts you at risk of is not covering things in sufficient depth and really just sort of skating over the top of a lot of the issues. Now, in the criteria grid, one of the criteria is your ability to engage in a critical analysis. So if you're just skating over the top of the issues, then you're not going to have that depth and you're not going to do very well on that criteria. So if you get to the point where you think you've got way too much information and you're going to be way over the word limit, you're going to have to refocus at that point. So things that you could consider at that point in helping you scale it back down to a manageable size is, are you looking at more than one technology? Some of you are. So when you use the word biometric, can you, and you're looking at biometrics more generally, for example, could you scale it back to just looking at fingerprints, or just looking at iris scanners, or just looking at facial recognition? Some of you may already be looking at one technology. If that's the case, consider other ways that you can limit the context. So perhaps look at it at the use only in the private space, or the use of the technology only in the public space. So then again, you're cutting down the amount of discussion that you need to have. And that's probably quite important, because some of our expectations of privacy might differ in that private setting to the public. So they could be very different discussions in your paper as well. So if you are trying to cover both, it might be a good idea to think about that now, about whether you might just want to focus on one aspect. Another way that you could reduce the scope is to look at the technology in a particular context in terms of the purpose of its use. Okay, why is it being used? So is it covert surveillance or overt surveillance? So covert would be private investigators, for example, whereas overt would be you walk down the street and you see CCTV right in front of you, or it's well signaged. Okay, so you might want to think about limiting it to that particular type of use. Other alternatives is to think about particular users of the technology, so who is using it, and limiting it that way. So you could just look, I know with the facial, I'm just giving you an example, the facial recognition technology, schools are looking at using it for truancy investigations. Casinos are looking at using it to try and exclude problem gamblers. So you could just look at the casino's use of it, or you could just look at the school's use of it, or you could just look at private investigators or an insurance companies who look into people who are fraudulently claiming, or something like that. So you could limit it to particular users of the technology as well. And even in doing that, don't be frightened of that, because you'd still have to have those discussions about privacy and what the law allows them to do and prohibits them at the moment, and then how the law might need to change to reflect contemporary thoughts about privacy. Now, if I had identified the scope as a problem in your project plan, that means you absolutely have to look at it, because I already know that you're going to be well over the word limit. But if I haven't identified it in your plan, I think it's probably still a good idea just to review it as an ongoing thing. And once you think it starts to get too large, try and think about how to reframe the project to make it that back to a manageable size. Another thing to talk about is structure. So most of you had not worked out your structure yet in your project plan. And while that's not absolutely, crucial at this stage, it's really something that you need to have in the next week or two at the latest, because it's going to refine the writing process for you. And most importantly, it's going to help you pinpoint if you're missing anything in your research. If you sit there and start with the headings, and by headings I mean the main headings, so aside from your introduction, what's the first key discussion that's going to take place? Give it a heading. Second, what's the next thing to talk about? Give that a heading. And then under each heading, do a summary. And it doesn't have to be full sentences, but it has to be a summary that you understand represents a particular thing that you're going to talk about. So do a very brief summary of what you're going to say under that section. And then you need to put in the sources that are going to relate to that particular section. If you can do that, you will start to see, one, whether your discussions flow logically, whether you are being too biased and one-sided, and whether you need to look at the strengths and weaknesses of each side's argument in more detail. It's going to help you also identify where you've got those missing sources. At that point, you can regroup, go and do that extra research that you need, and you've also got a working plan to start the writing process. When I do plans like that, I actually start typing the real content, the real draft, underneath the summary of what I'm going to say, so that I can keep referring back to it as I'm typing away, to keep myself on track in that section so that I don't go off on a tangent. So I actually use the plan becomes my working draft. So I think if you're concerned about the structure, one of the things that you can do obviously is reach out to me, but also just put the headings on the forums and see what people think about whether or not that structure makes sense, what they're thinking about doing if they're working on a similar topic. Okay, then we've got sources. So there's 4 S's here: scope, structure, sources. So what I was tending to notice were that people were dominant on a particular source type. So some people had got lots of primary sources but no secondary. Some people had got lots of secondary and no primary sources. And quite a few of you hadn't got anything beyond what was in the Queensland Law Reform Commission's paper. So a couple of things to note is that if you're only using the law reform paper, it's going to be evident when it comes to writing the full draft. So that will be obvious to me, and obviously research is one of the criteria. Secondly, really, to have a thorough analysis of any particular area, you need a mix of primary and secondary. So the primary explains what the existing law is, so that you can then analyze that and say why it's problematic, what it doesn't do, what it does well, but particularly what it doesn't do, where the gaps are, etc. So you do need the primary sources in there to give that background information that paves the way for your critical analysis. And then many of you are lacking in the secondary sources department. Now that can be broader than what you would normally see in a legal essay, so in a law essay, sorry. So secondary sources can be your traditional law journals, which obviously come from the legal databases, but it can also be interdisciplinary sources as well, whether it's psychologists, sociologists, IT experts, information from government websites, so government reports, for example. You can include data, which we're going to talk about obviously in the workshop today, and you can display that data as a graphic in your project plan. You don't have to write it all out into sentences, so it doesn't have to be text-based if you don't want it to. So all of those are really useful, but one thing I want you to be careful of is news sources. So I talk in the study guide about reputable news sources. There's a lot of news that hasn't been properly fact-checked, and also there's a lot of that sort of viral, I don't like using the word fake news because apparently everything's fake news these days, but you know, it's viral news not from reputable sources, downloaded from places like social media. So if you are going to refer to news stories, just think about whether or not it's a valuable resource or whether you could get that information elsewhere, and try not to use it if there are alternatives. I'm going to go on to sentence structure separately in a minute. 2 final things there: proofreading and AGLC. So in some of the work there were lots of typos, some really long sentences that didn't make sense, some sentences were half finished. It's obvious to the marker if you haven't proofread your work. Now you might think, oh well, that just shows that we haven't proofread it, but actually that creates a really negative impression in the marker, because it suggests to the marker that you probably didn't start this work in advance of the deadline. You were probably working right up till the deadline and didn't have time to proofread, and then that reflects back on the quality of your work. So it causes the reader or the marker to question the quality of your work in a more general sense. Have you got enough sources? Have you argued things well enough? Because their initial impression is this hasn't been proofread, it means it's rushed. So just think a bit about leaving in a little block of time before the final project is due to really make sure that you thoroughly proofread your work. The other thing is referencing. The AGLC has a definitive list of rules. You either get them right or you get them wrong. It's something that you should be getting right in your second year and above. So please make sure that you can comply with the AGLC. Again, it's mentioned in the criteria. And remember that we're doing this for your own good. For those of you that become practitioners, if you don't comply with the format of a court order or a court form, it gets thrown out and you have to resubmit it with costs, or sometimes they refuse to accept it. So learning how to do the AGLC and comply with the legal profession's conventions about things is actually an important part of being a lawyer. Okay, so I now want to look at sentence structure in particular. So why am I looking at this? And I think it's because what tends to happen is that when something is complicated or it's difficult, it's in a difficult area of the law, or it's, it's complex in the way that the law is put together, then we quite often become convoluted ourselves in the way that we explain it. We've struggled to break it down into a manageable format for the reader. Because it's complex to us, it becomes complex in our writing of it. So one of the things that we need to do is break down sentences. The more complex the material is, the more sentences you need to explain it, because if you've got lots of commas, lots of ands and buts and or in your sentence, you're making the sentence long, and that makes it hard for the reader to hunt for the key message that's coming out of that sentence. So please stick to 1 point per sentence and break sentences down. So to keep them concise and short, you need to think very carefully about whether the information you've put in there can become two separate sentences or not. The other thing that we need to talk about is the active and passive voice. So the passive voice, I know you've been told this in first year, but quite a lot of people don't really understand what it is. So the passive voice makes things longer, and it puts the subject of the sentence at the end, which means you have to wait until the very end to understand who is doing what. So the traditional order of a sentence is subject, verb, object. I'm sure that that was drilled into you at school. So the subject is the person doing the verb, and the object is the person receiving the action in the verb. Okay, but in a passive voice context, that subject moves right to the end, and you have to wait until the end of the sentence to find out who's doing the action. So the example on the slide there, these reforms were recommended by CASA. So that's in the passive voice. Who's doing the recommending? It's CASA, so they're the subject. The verb is obviously recommend, and what receives the the outcome of the action, it's the reform. So the correct order is the sentence below. So CASA recommended these reforms. Okay, now that you can still understand that passive voice sentence at the top there because it's short. So there's no problem with that. There's nothing grammatically wrong with it. It's just that the passive voice can make sentences longer and more complex. But I want you to imagine where that features within a longer sentence with commas or conjunctions like and or but. At that point, it can make the sentence very difficult for the reader. And if it's complex legal principles you're talking about, it again becomes another level up. It's another level of difficulty for the reader to understand what you're trying to say. So wherever possible, stick to that subject, verb, object organization of the sentence. Okay, and then we've got superfluous words. So there's lots of situations where we write things that are could be said in one word but are said in between 3 and 4 words. So you can see there, as a result of or as a consequence of, you could just write the word because. A verb nominalization is where you take a verb like negotiate, to negotiate, and you convert it into a noun. So negotiation is the noun, and you can see there that makes the sentence much longer. So they entered into negotiations is longer than they negotiated. And then we've also got linking clauses like in relation to, which really just means regarding or concerning. So with your word limits of 2,500 words, be alert to those kinds of things. Again, there's nothing grammatically wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with saying as a result of, but you've used 4 words there rather than 1. So when you're up against your word limit, it might help to go through and cut all of that kind of superfluous words out. Now, just one comment in relation to in regards to, because it's my pet hate. In regards to isn't grammatically correct. It's not a real sentence. So regards means give my regards to, give my best wishes to, right? So regard is regarding, concerning. So in regards to doesn't actually say regarding, it says in best wishes to, or a version of that. if you want to use in regard to, you should actually, in regards to, you should actually use with regard to. That's the correct grammatical arrangement of that particular phrase. Or in relation to is another way of doing it. For some reason, we've kind of merged in relation to, with regard to, into in regards to, and there's just no such thing as that. Okay, but as I say, you'd probably be better off with regarding or concerning because they're much shorter. And finally, try and stick to one idea per paragraph or one discussion per paragraph. So 1 point per sentence, but also one idea per paragraph. And sometimes those ideas are quite large. So if that's the case, more than one paragraph is fine, but a maximum of one idea per paragraph. Otherwise, again, way too much text in a block for the reader. Now that might be okay for your marker who's kind of experienced at, weeding through all the text and working out what you're trying to say. But overall, markers are in a rush against a time limit usually. So at the end of semester, I'll be marking 3 different subjects worth of papers, for example. So you just don't want to create that impression of it just being dense and difficult to work through for the reader. Okay, final paragraph, and then I'll come back to you. So this is just an example of how poor expression can impact not just on the language component of the criteria grid. So that normally when you get a criteria grid, you'll get things like, imagine it's a problem question, you might get identifies the issues, explains the law, cites suitable sources, applies to the law, and then you'll get an expression at the end, expresses the content in a professional manner or whatever. So yes, poor expression obviously reflects there, but it actually reflects into the other elements as well, like application or explanation of the law, because it gives the overall impression that you're not quite on top of the material in the same way as something that's clear and precise and concise. So just take a moment to just read those 2 different paragraphs. Now they say exactly the same thing, but one is just expressed better than the other. I want you to think about why one is better than the other as well when you're reading it. Okay, so what do you guys think? Which one do you prefer? First paragraph or the second one? So Stephanie says the second one. Kat says the second one reads better and is more simple to understand. Rebecca, Chan, everyone is talking about the second one being the best, first one hard to read. So I think we're all agreed. But the question is, why do you guys think that? What is it about the first paragraph that makes it more poorly expressed? Christopher says, ha ha, kick in. Well, yeah, that's casual language. That's the kind of way we would express things if we're talking to someone rather than in a professional document. Chan says the first one is long-winded. That's right. Stephanie points out it's one giant sentence. It's full of commas and ands, but it's not got any full stops. That's absolutely right. There's quite a lot. I mean, these are called comma splices. It's where there really should be punctuation, i.e. a full stop, or a conjunction, such as and instead they just fill it with a comma to keep the sentence going. Okay, that's called a comma splice. Things like it's, we wouldn't use contractions in legal writing. We would use it is, because again, it's just more professional. But also, if you look at that first line, it should be it apostrophe s anyway, because that would be a contraction of it is. So there's a grammatical issue there anyway, but we would use it is just because it's more professional. Doesn't is a similar one. We would use does not. What else have we got? Clinton says long complex sentences. The second paragraph is short to the point. Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots about it. It's also the way that they explain the information. Often it's like they're winding themselves up to talk about it rather than just getting down to what the point of that particular sentence is as well. So all of that shows the difference. Now, what I was trying to say earlier is that it's not just the expression criteria that is affected when the expression looks like that. What it actually does is it reflects back on, are they really on top of this material? Do they really understand it? So what I'm saying is that it may only slightly affect your grades, but it depends on, of course, where this is appearing in your work. If you're talking about the law and you're talking if you're talking in a lot of detail about the law and it's really hard and it's clumsy to work out what the law is, then it's going to make me think that you don't really understand the law. If you're talking about the application, maybe how the law works in practice and why it's problematic, again, it's going to make me think that maybe you don't really understand what the implications are. If you're talking about a secondary source that has criticized the way that the law works, and I'm really struggling to understand what the criticism is, it's going to make me think that you don't understand what the criticism is. So poor expression impacts upon several layers of the criteria, which then obviously takes you from a situation where if you could express it like the second paragraph, you're in your HDD zone and you're taking yourself back down to the pass credit area. Okay, it can make quite a significant difference. Okay, are there any questions about that? No? Okay, I'll come back to you now. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. I mean, some of it won't apply to you, and some of it may only apply to you at the drafting stage, but of course you guys are going to start thinking about drafting over the next few weeks. So it's a good idea to flag these issues as I've come across them so that you guys can at least have them on your radar when it comes to writing. Okay, so what I thought I would do now is show you, and you guys have already seen this because it's on Moodle, but show you the criteria grid and just briefly take you through that. Let me just share that now, just to talk very briefly about that, because I want you guys to write with that in mind. Okay, that's the one I want to share. Can you guys all see that? Yep, okay, good. Okay, so here you can see the first thing is design of an innovative research problem or question. So this really is triggering you to think about your title or question carefully, okay? Because the design of the research problem is, the first time I encounter that is the title, okay? The research title or the research question. And what I'm looking for when I'm marking under that criteria is really, does your title reflect what your key discussions will be? Does your title invite analysis rather than a yes/no answer? Okay, does it indicate that you're going to engage in a critical analysis of something rather than is the law effective at preventing people from repeating criminal offences, yes or no? Well, you could do that with stats and you're done. Here you go, yes, it shows that people who go to prison tend to repeat do repeat offences. The other thing is, have you identified an area of the law that will be involved in a critical analysis? So some of you are not really looking at the law, you've been focused on those secondary sources. And you need to make sure that the law component is there within the project, not necessarily within the title, but it needs to be within the project. So when I'm looking at this criteria, I'm also looking at the main components of the project as well as the title. And then also I'm looking to make sure that there is critical analysis in there as well. So make sure when you're designing the structure that there's a space where that occurs. Okay, and then we've got the next one, which is engage in legal and interdisciplinary research. So this recognises obviously that the interdisciplinary stuff is just as valuable as the legal stuff. And as I said, some of you are good on one and not the other. There doesn't tend to be that many people that have got all the sources that they need in both spheres. When you're looking at secondary sources though, bear in mind that where possible, we want peer-reviewed secondary sources from reputable journals, okay, not someone's blog. If there's nothing else out there, then yes, use the blog. But if there are secondary sources that have been peer-reviewed and published in journals, they're preferable. You can also use your government sources, UN websites, all of that is absolutely fine, okay? And secondary sources from other disciplines, as I've said. The next one is structure a reasoned logical argument with citation of suitable evidence and sources in support. So this is about the structure and flow, what sources you've relied upon, and here it's also about whether or not you're thinking about whose ideas form your opinion, okay? So this is just a word of warning. It's not good enough if you've got a paragraph that features 6 points from a journal article to only cite that article once. It's not enough to do that. You are taking their ideas and representing them as your own. If you've made 6 sentences with 6 points, you need 6 references. Okay, every time you use someone else's idea in a sentence, you need to cite the source. If it's not your idea, cite the source at the end of the sentence. Okay, that's just a matter of ethics in terms of using research. All right, critical analysis of legal and interdisciplinary sources. So that's really looking at how you evaluate what you've got, what you've presented. So can you identify issues with the regulatory system, whether it's the law itself, the way it's enforced, the number of agencies involved, it doesn't matter, but there's got to be some critical analysis there. If you're looking at secondary sources and you've got debate on both sides, how do you evaluate that tension between the two camps? Do they all carry the same weight, or are some more reputable than others? Are there strengths and weaknesses in both sides? Or have you found that there's a body of opinion over here and then just an outlier? Okay, so you need to evaluate the sources that you use as well. Then we've got conclusions. So the conclusion must not introduce new material and must reflect the discussions throughout. Students quite often spoil, this is just what we see generally, students spoil their answers because they'll start to say stuff that they've not said previously in their conclusion, or alternatively, they contradict themselves. So make sure that your conclusion really reflects what you've already said and that you've built towards that overall view. And then finally, professional presentation. So this is looking at the format of the document that you have prepared, layout, headings, paragraph. Is it easy to read and find what I'm looking for? Your expression here. So is the language fluent? Have you explained concepts in short, concise sentences that are clear? Grammar, spelling, and your referencing all fall within that criteria. Okay, so I'm going to stop that now and come back to you. Okay, so are there any questions about the criteria? No? Okay, well, I think that's you guys are all prepped for starting to write now then. So I'll stop talking about that and boring you to death with all of that information. But it's important that that's there so it's in your mindset as you're writing. Okay, so let's talk about data and how we might present that data if it's useful to us. So have any of you found any data so far that you think is actually quite informative and might be relevant to your project? Kat says some. And Stephanie says some. So what kind of material have you found so far?
I've actually found a lot of, I don't know how to explain, like survivor testimonies or like abuse victim testimonies, family, you know, through secondary sources, news articles, the Royal Commission. So lots of qualitative stuff. which
Yeah.
I think adds power to what my particular area is, simply because there isn't a lot of field of research and there's not a lot of secondary peer-reviewed journal articles and different things on this area. So it's more of, okay, these are the lived experience voices of the people, which is why the law needs to catch up.
Yeah. So for those of you that don't know, Stephanie's looking at aged care and the use of covert surveillance to detect abuse. So although there's been quite a lot of media stuff about that, there's not a lot published on that so much. And so it's interesting that you found the qualitative stuff, because that really adds the social dimension to how the law is failing. You know, when you talk about testimonies and experiences, probably they're talking about why it was important for that surveillance to occur, even though it was in breach of the care homes policy. You know, it adds a dimension to understanding why regulation is needed. So it's actually really useful data, even though we tend to see quantitative data instead. That's what we're usually presented with, right? So for those of you that struggle to understand the difference, people prefer, 4 out of 10 people prefer dogs to cats. That's a statistic. So that would be quantitative. It's a statistic based on numbers, okay? But if you were to conduct an interview with someone and ask them to describe how they felt during a particular event in their life, or let's just say you're investigating the way victims experience cross-examination, you know, for them to talk about feeling traumatized when they were cross-examined, that would be qualitative, okay? Now, you can have a mix of the two, because you could start to pull statistics out of qualitative data, right? You could actually say 7 out of 10 witnesses described feeling traumatized. Okay, so you can pull numbers out of qualitative, but qualitative data is generally, there's less conducted. You know, you might have 20 or 30 interviews, whereas with quantitative, you could survey thousands of people. Okay, so there are reasons why people will select one over the other. If you're looking at data sets, i.e. Numbers, statistics, you generally want a survey that represents a cross-section of society. And for statistical validity, you need, you know, quite a lot of responses, you know, probably over 200 responses to really get validity to the sample that you have extracted. So whereas you wouldn't have that with qualitative. No one would criticize you for only interviewing 30 people. So the parameters of the two are different. When they're mixed together, they can be really powerful, because you get that story element that we were talking about, but you can also start to see a trend of, well, this is how victims feel, or this is how people perceive this particular thing. So all of that can be so useful when we're trying to understand how the law works in reality, rather than just looking at it as the black letter law. What else have we got here? So Kat says, I've got annual reports relating to young people, because Kat's looking at bullying, so looking at bullying through technology. And Tammy Lee says, lots of bullying data and the psychological effect. So again, that might be expressed in quantitative, Tammy. It might be numbers and statistics of how many students are affected by it, how many experience mild depression or anxiety or whatever. But it can also give us an overall picture that still enables us to comment on society and how we need to tackle the bullying issue. Kat says, there isn't much on cyberbullying data complaints. I'm finding bullying under one banner. I am suggesting that complaints be more specific to engage in the need for a tribunal based on that data. Most of the data is in the social sciences as opposed to law. Well, that again, because you're looking at how the law works in practice, it does tend to get shoehorned in that direction. In the real world, when we're looking at policy change, you'd want to have a mix of the two. You'd want that legal and social science disciplines to come together to solve that wicked problem. Unfortunately, though, we all tend to learn at university in our own silos. And that doesn't necessarily represent the reality of going out into the real world. I think it's a good point, Kat, that actually that's something to comment on in your data. So if you present that data, you need to show the weaknesses in the data, that you cannot be sure how much of that is attributable to the cyber-based bullying and how much is traditional bullying, the physical bullying or face-to-face bullying. And that's just, yeah, that doesn't mean that your project is weaker because you can't find what you need. What it shows is that you've analyzed your sources. So it's actually a big thumbs up for you, even though it doesn't feel like it when you can't find what you need. Does that make sense? Yeah, it doesn't feel like much. Yeah, I appreciate that, because we all want the answer that we're looking for. I'm going to find out about this topic and I want to go and get a data set that reflects that, and then you can't find it. I understand that. But it's absolutely fine to just say, this is what's available. And isn't it not acceptable that we can't work out the magnitude of the problem because nobody's drilled down into the data enough? Okay, anyone else want to talk about the data that they have started to look at? Okay, well, I'm just going to show you, I had a little bit of fun with Infogram earlier. So I found some statistics, I was just reading the news and I found an article about the effect of COVID-19 on working people, people who work, and then there was the homeschooling during lockdown. And so I thought I'd just show you those. It took me literally 10 minutes and I quite enjoyed messing around with it. I've just got to find it now. Hang on, give me a second. Where's the internet gone? Hang on a minute, I've got to get the internet back up. 1 second. For some reason I've closed it down. Okay, let's try and share that now. Here we go. So that's just my Zoom sign in. Hang on. Now, where is it? Oh, well, just before we do that, I wanted to show you this because I thought it was really interesting. It was just really interesting. So we're getting to that age of technology where you don't just get information presented in a really interesting way. We're also now getting interactive data. So for example, this is working out whether or not we're alone in the universe using the Drake equation, which is a really complex equation. But this is how it's broken down to really help people understand it. So this is on the informationisbeautiful.net website. So if you look at the original Drake values, so the original equation, it tells you that there are, so many stars born per year. You have to put that in the equation with the number of stars with planets, the number of habitable planets per solar system, then the percentage chance of a habitable planet develops life, percentage chance that life develops intelligence, then can they communicate across space, then the length of time for the civilization to send that signal, then it gives you the calculation. So you'll see the original calculation was, we probably have 10 civilizations in the galaxy, and then in the universe, possibly 1.5 billion. So that's the original Drake values. Let's go for the lowest possible though and redo the calculation. And you'll see none in the galaxy. But in the universe, there may be 42 others looking for us. So I just thought that was really a great way of displaying something really complex. I mean, we don't understand, unless you've done astrophysics, that we don't understand all these symbols, but it really does explain in a simple way for us. Now, let me find my, so this was what I was looking at, what I was doing earlier on today when I was just playing with Infogram. So you'll see that 3/4 of households with children did not send their children to school during lockdown. So 76%, that should have the other statistic there, but I didn't get around to putting it in. 76% of homes did not send their children to school during lockdown. So what did that look like for us? Well, how did we adapt to that homeschooling situation? Well, 52% decided to work from home, huge slice of the pie. 17.81% took leave. So they took annual leave or used sick leave or whatever they could use to be at home with their children. And 30.14% adjusted their working hours to suit. So you can see there was a massive impact there on working parents during COVID. Now, I didn't get around to doing it, but the data shows that something like 46, I'm just remembering off the top of my head, 46% of women had, so this is 46% of women who were having to have children at home because of homeschooling. 46% of women homeschooled alone, whereas only 17, or it might have been 18% of men homeschooled alone. So the main responsibility for the children was at the women's end. So there you go. Now, what I wanted to show you as well is there's a couple of situations where we're starting to see this sort of infographic trend coming into legal documents. So here, Stefania Passera is a designer of information sheets and legal documents, but she puts them into language that people can understand, but also uses symbols and flowcharts and things like that to explain things. So you can see this is just an example here. But in a tenancy agreement, you've got little symbols to represent things for clients. And note that they're not in the traditional layout of a clause, 8.11, 8.12, 8.13. And we've got bold to really instill in the reader what the key parts of that sentence are. So that's just an example of legal design. She's got lots of other things as well. It's not working now. So you can see that there's just here tells you about when the document is applicable and the different ways, so different graphics to explain particular terms, and shows the reader how the terms are connected to each other and when they're not. So really interesting way of setting out information. And then we've got a piece in the conversation about the way that comic contracts have been used to help people understand the law, and it actually looks like this. So this is going to appear in the next edition of my book, by the way. So this is an employment contract with Oricon, and you can see that the entire thing, it has text, but the entire thing has comic book imagery to help explain the content of the text. So you can see here, this is what we expect from our employees. So you work whatever the hours is per week, but sometimes you may need to put in more hours without extra pay. And so you've got a little thing that shows you all of that. And then coming down here, this says what the employee can expect from their employer. So you've got things about holiday pay and being paid while you're on holiday, that there will be an annual review, that will pay your super. So the whole entire employment contract was put into this format, which is just really interesting because it shows you, I'll come back to you now, it shows you that the law is really evolving in many different ways. So we're seeing technological disruption. So there will be eventually software that will, in fact, there is already software that is available that scans the trial file and identifies the discrepancies between the witnesses' accounts, and areas that require cross-examination, inconsistencies with documentary evidence. It can scan your contract and identify where you're contradicting yourself or where the clauses don't align and all of those kinds of things. So there's that side of things. Then you've got the apps that are designed to take the lawyer out of the equation. So there's ones where you plug in what you're looking for, they plug in what they're looking for, and then you get a compatible settlement agreement. And then of course we've got this, lawyers now providing a lot more information to the public either for free or for a much more reduced fee, but it's a different type of service. So it's not necessarily personalized and tailored to their unique situation. It's more generic, a bit like that contract that we just had a look at. And then there's that added layer of people are going a step further and saying, okay, let's reframe the way that we deliver our services, and we'll give you comic books that basically represent contracts. So there's a whole lot of evolution going on, and you guys are really, you're going to be the ones that are out there sort of either contending with it or leading the way with it. So lots of, and Kat says, yeah, and that's what I was just about to say. Great for visual learners or those with reading impairments. There's lots of ways of displaying information, and I am happy for you to take the idea of a chart or a graphic and put that into your project if it helps present the information and the point that you're trying to make. So don't be frightened to do that if you would like to. Okay, so for those of you that haven't found data yet, is there any data that you would like to find but you don't know where to look, or you just haven't got round to looking? Do you think that, have you thought about it and thought whether data would actually help your project and help explain some of the issues you're discussing? Ashley says, I'm working on drones, so I'm just in the stage of figuring out what data to look for. Okay, one of the things off the top of my head, Ashley, is whether or not you can find out how many recreational drones are purchased per year. So at the moment, the regulation of drones is they have to weigh more than, I think it's 2 kilos, or be used in a commercial setting for the safety regulations to apply to them. So you want to work out, well, there's no regulation of recreational drones, but how many of them are around these days? So if you can find statistics on that, that might be a good idea. You might be able to find that in the Eyes in the Sky report or some of the other publications on government websites and things like that. One of the other things that you could look for is maybe whether or not there are any statistics on drones being used in criminal offences like stalking and stuff like that. I don't think you'll find that yet because I imagine it's not yet a thing, but you never know. Christopher says, data would definitely help, but I cannot find any Australian data on the facial recognition text, mainly American. American is fine as long as you evaluate it, Christopher. So you can say, you know, it's being used in this, you know, this percentage of situations in CBDs or whatever, or this number of states are using it and this number aren't, or it's been inaccurate, found to be inaccurate in this number of cases, and just have it in your footnotes that it's American data. If you think that it's wrong for the context of Australia, then you need to obviously make that a discussion that you have. But if you think that it's analogous, you know, if you're looking at its inaccuracy in the software, maybe there's no difference between Australia and America. And you can just take that data and use it and say it's likely that it will be similar here. Okay, anyone else? Yeah, so I think, you know, with this a lot of this technology, Australia is lagging behind in terms of its use and the problems that have stemmed from these new modern technologies, emerging technologies. So it is okay to look at overseas for the data. You just, as I say, got to think about the context and whether or not those jurisdictions also have unique aspects that twist the data or impacts upon the data. Not much data with surveillance in regional areas except in relation to the NBN project. Well, that may be true. I think it depends. You might be able to find a government report that maybe, it depends on what you're looking for, but you might be able to find a government report on that. Anything else? Nope. Okay, does anyone have any questions about the content for this week or previous weeks? Because we're now at the end of the sort of learning about research, and we're going to start focusing on presenting our research from this point onwards. So next week we look at legal writing, then we look at oral presentation of information, and then we've got that peer review. So try and have your first draft ready for then. We've got peer review in the following week to give you feedback, and then we've got the reflection on what you've covered and what in the learning journey. So we're really kind of at that end of the research process. So if anyone's got any comments about, you know, anything that we've covered to date, then please raise it now.
Nicola,
Yep.
have I missed something about the process for this peer review? How does that happen?
So in week 10, you'll need to find someone to swap a draft with. Now, it doesn't have to be a final draft, and you can have sections in there where you say, I need to write more about this, or I need more information on this. You can also put questions in there for them to answer, like, does this make sense? You know, does this flow well? Do I need more here? Whatever. And the idea is that you just swap drafts and you provide each other with feedback. And there's guidance in the study guide on how to do that to make sure that you're both getting value out of the feedback process. And it's as much about receiving feedback as providing it, because you learn a little bit more about the criteria and what the marker looks for when you act as the marker. It kind of gives you that insight into what what a good project looks like. So yeah, that's week 10 to 11. You'll do that with a partner.
Just on that note, with plagiarism, only because I am petrified of that stuff, sharing my work with someone, can it be someone that's not doing our topic, and then that way we don't really run that conflict or temptation for someone, maybe?
Okay, well, the way you can avoid that is to pick someone who isn't working on your topic if you're worried about that. So, you know, if, say, Stephanie's looking at aged care and say you're looking at drones, then she's not going to plagiarize you a week before it's due in and change her topic entirely to mirror yours. Okay, so yeah. Not that I'm suggesting you'd ever do that, Stephanie. But
I'm sure she wouldn't.
No, but if you pick someone who's on a completely different topic, then you're going to avoid that temptation. The other thing as well is that it might actually be a good idea to pick someone who's not on your topic, because then that person is like me, coming to it for the first time, haven't got all that, you know, insider knowledge from working on that topic. So you can really look at whether that person can really look at how does a reader with no context feel about your project? What do they think about your project? But yeah, so that's the trick, is just to find someone who's not on that if you're worried about that. It's absolutely fine, though, for other people to swap with people that they just feel comfortable with.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Nope. Okay. All right. Well, that's us on time. So I hope that was helpful in terms of starting to prep you towards your writing. Next week, we'll look at writing in a bit more detail and talk about, you know, structure of paragraphs and effective writing techniques and things like that. Other than that, I wish you all a really wonderful weekend, and I will see you next week. Thank you. If you have any questions or you don't understand any of the feedback, though, please get in touch. What I'm here for. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.